Well, for more on that story, we're joined now by an observer of women's rights in Saudi Arabia. Ida Lichter is an Australian psychiatrist and author of the book Muslim Women Reformers, Inspiring Voices Against Oppression. The book argues that the way Islam has been interpreted in nations like Saudi Arabia amounts to institutionalised gender discrimination. Ida Lichter, thanks very much for coming in and talking to the world this evening.
Thank you, Nick.
Saudi Arabia has been pretty much untouched by the sort of social unrest which the Arab Spring has brought to many of its neighbours so far this year. Is this a sign that Saudi Arabia is accepting that it has to embrace change?
I'm sure it is a sign, and it's very welcome, but I would be a little cautious about it.
Cautious how?
Well, there was an instance several years ago when a reformer called Nadia Bakurji found a loophole in the legislation, and she went for municipal elections, and it was stopped because the authorities said they weren't ready for it. And what that really means is that they would need to change very basic issues because it's a sexist society. There's segregation. It's what the reformers call gender apartheid. And they would need to have female officers at polling booths and indeed female polling booths. They would have to change the guardianship laws so that women could leave the house without permission, and it would maybe unravel everything. Perhaps women, they say, might want to wear whatever they like when they go out.
Okay, so you're suggesting this is the Pandora's box,
Yes.
so to speak, which
Yes.
would lead to an unravelling of the repressive regime in Saudi Arabia.
It could very well do that. It's the same with the driving issue. If women are allowed to drive, what is that going to lead to? They'll be able to go out by themselves.
Okay, just bring us up to speed on that, because what we've seen this year in Saudi Arabia have been attempts by activists there to actually drive in public. In Saudi Arabia,
Yes.
women are not allowed to do that.
No, and there was this case of Manal El-Sharif, a young woman who said, I'm going to go out and drive. And she took a video of herself and she was arrested. And there was another case when a woman went out to get her vitamin E injections from the hospital and she was arrested. Incidentally, that's quite interesting because the cloaking, the complete cover, can induce vitamin E deficiency.
Okay, but in this case, this is an example of activists pushing the boundaries. This is the king of Saudi Arabia actually issuing this edict. Now, how likely do you think is it that it will lead to real and lasting change?
It's hard to say because he is in a bind, and the bind comes from the relationship between the Wahhabi establishment, in other words, the clerical establishment and the Saudi monarchy. And it goes back to the pact that they had originally, which meant that the legitimacy of the Saudi monarchy depends on the clerics. Now, in the past, whenever he's wanted to modernise, they've said, oh, this is a Western idea and we don't want any of it. But I think with the Arab Spring, what's happened is that they can see that there's a lot of ferment from below, from within. And in fact, there have been increasing numbers of organisations within Saudi Arabia, human rights organisations, and men. Can you imagine men coming out on television and saying, we want women to drive? The very first human rights organisation for women was started by a man. And so you've got this new demand, and even a demand for a constitutional monarchy, and that's something very, very, very new.
Okay, 2 points. You're arguing that this will be a test of the king's authority within his own kingdom, but will this also further embolden the pro-democracy movement within Saudi Arabia and give voice to that movement?
I think it will. I think there'll be more and more demands, and he's responding to those demands. In fact, I believe he's a reformist himself, but his hands have been tied, and it'll be most interesting to see what happens now that perhaps there's a chink in the armour. But he recognises that empowerment is very important. After all, women are half the population, and he's not going to stop it. And in Kuwait, for example, there was a very big push by women. They had to fight the conservatives who said, you can't do this, this is blasphemous, it's anti-family, and they were called all sorts of insults, but they got it in the end.
Okay, the example of Kuwait shows us that if change comes, it can actually come quite quickly, that women got the vote in Kuwait in 2005.
Exactly, and in 2007 they stood for election, and 4 of them got in.
Okay, so could we see women gaining real power within Saudi Arabia within the coming years?
There needs to be a better civil society. They haven't got the infrastructure. I mean, after all, they haven't even got freedom of speech, of association, of assembly. They haven't got trade unions, they haven't got an independent judiciary. All the things we need that they need for electoral change, they haven't got it yet. But it might come slowly. And they also need to reform the Islamist ideas with this system called ijtihad, which will change the way that they're looking at some of the laws, and the idea of separating the religion and state.
Okay, Ida Lichter, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for talking to the world.
Thank you, Nick.